January 17, 1943, 27,000 feet above the Wilhelmshaven shipyards. The air at that altitude burns the lungs. Every breath through an oxygen mask feels like swallowing frozen needles. Inside the cramped waist gunner position of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski watches condensation freeze instantly on the interior metal panels. His hands, even through electrically heated gloves, have gone numb. The temperature hovers at 58 degrees below zero. Through the open gun port, wind screams past at 170 miles per hour. Below, somewhere beneath the quilted cloud cover, lies the heart of Nazi Germany's naval production. Above, the sky holds nothing but the pale January sun and the contrails of 300 American bombers carving white scars across European airspace. Kowalski has been in the air for 4 hours. His crew departed Molesworth Air Base in England before dawn, joining the massive formation that represents the largest American daylight bombing raid attempted thus far in the European theater. The mission planners called it an experiment. The British called it suicide. Royal Air Force commanders had abandoned daylight strategic bombing 18 months earlier after losing aircraft at rates that threatened to destroy bomber command entirely. They switched to night operations, to area bombing, to survival. Now they watched with professional skepticism as American commanders insisted their new doctrine would succeed where British experience had failed. The Americans believed their heavily armed bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, could penetrate German airspace in broad daylight, strike precision targets, and return home. The British believed the Americans would learn the same lessons they had learned, written in burning aluminum and young men's lives. Kowalski knows nothing of these strategic debates. He knows the gun mount before him, the ammunition belts feeding into twin 50-caliber machine guns, and the section of sky he must defend. He knows the faces of the 9 other men aboard this aircraft: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, tail gunner, another waist gunner across the fuselage, 10 men inside a metal tube flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The first German fighters appear at 10:47 hours. They come from the sun, diving out of blinding brightness with the tactical precision that Luftwaffe pilots have perfected over 3 years of aerial warfare. Focke-Wulf 190s, painted in winter camouflage, their engines screaming as they slash through the American formation. The lead fighter's nose erupts with synchronized fire from 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Kowalski watches tracer rounds arc toward his bomber, impossibly slow from a distance, then suddenly streaking past with the sound of tearing metal. He returns fire, the twin 50s hammering against their mounts, shell casings ejecting in golden streams that bounce and roll across the aircraft floor. The German fighter breaks away, rolling inverted and diving beneath the formation. Another appears, then another, then 6 more coming from different angles, different altitudes, coordinating their attacks to split defensive fire. The radio fills with urgent voices calling out fighter positions, warnings, damage reports. A B-17 200 yards to port takes a direct hit to its number 3 engine. The propeller windmills wildly, then stops. Black smoke streams from the cowling. The aircraft drops out of formation, losing altitude, falling away from the protective guns of its companions. German fighters swarm it immediately, like wolves cutting a wounded animal from the herd. Kowalski fires until his gun barrels glow cherry red in the frozen air. The smell of cordite and hot metal overwhelms even the thin oxygen supply. His world contracts to the computing sight reticle, the stream of tracers, the constant scan for new threats. Shell casings pile ankle-deep around his boots. Somewhere in his peripheral awareness, he registers that his aircraft is still flying, still maintaining position, still somehow intact despite the maelstrom of steel fragmenting the air around them. 40 miles to the east, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler leads his staffel through a climbing turn, positioning for another attack run. Stigler is 27 years old, a veteran fighter pilot with over 400 combat missions flown. He wears the Knight's Cross at his throat, earned through achievement that represents both skill and survival in a profession where most men die before accumulating such experience. Before the war, he flew commercial aircraft for Lufthansa. He remembers navigation by landmarks, flying passengers who complained about minor turbulence, landing schedules, and weather delays. That world exists now only as a ghost memory, something he can barely recognize as part of his own history. The man who flew passenger routes died somewhere over the Eastern Front, or perhaps during the Battle of Britain, replaced by this creature of altitude and violence, whose entire existence focuses on the destruction of other aircraft and the men inside them. But Stigler is also a warrior who maintains respect for certain principles of aerial combat, codes inherited from the Knights of the Great War, from von Richthofen and Bolk, and those early pilots who fought with a sense of chivalry even while killing each other. He will not shoot at parachuting airmen. He will not strafe lifeboats. He will fight with ferocity but within boundaries that separate warriors from murderers. Today, watching the American bombers approach through his gun sight, Stigler experiences something he has not felt before: professional astonishment. He has attacked these Boeing B-17s before during previous American raids. He has studied intelligence briefings describing their specifications, their defensive armament, their operational doctrine. But reading reports and encountering the reality are different experiences entirely. The Americans fly in formations so tight that their wingtips nearly overlap, creating interlocking fields of defensive fire that transform individual bombers into unified weapons platforms. Each B carries 13 machine guns, distributed across multiple positions to provide 360-degree coverage. The formations stack these individual defense systems into layered zones of fire that approaching fighters must penetrate. Stigler has fought against the best aircraft and pilots that Britain, Russia, and America could deploy. He has dueled Spitfires over the Channel, tangled with Yaks above the steppes, measured himself against every fighter type the Allies possess. But attacking heavy bombers differs fundamentally from fighter versus fighter combat. Fighters maneuver, dodge, employ their agility as both weapon and defense. Bombers simply absorb punishment and continue flying. They do not turn away. They do not break formation. They proceed toward their targets with mechanical inevitability, weathering attacks that would destroy any other aircraft, maintaining course even as they burn. He watches one B-17 take concentrated fire from 3 fighters simultaneously. Cannon shells tear through the aluminum skin, punching holes large enough to see through. The No. 2 engine explodes in a bloom of orange flame. Hydraulic fluid streams from severed lines, whipping away in the slipstream. The tail section shows damage so extensive that structural failure seems imminent. And still the aircraft maintains position, still its guns fire, still it flies. Stigler presses his attack, closing to 200 meters, his finger tightening on the firing button. The B-17 fills his windscreen, growing larger with each fraction of a second, its waist guns blazing directly at him. Tracer rounds bracket his fighter, the American gunner adjusting his aim, walking the stream of bullets closer. Stigler fires a 3-second burst, watching his rounds impact the bomber's fuselage and wing, seeing pieces of metal tear away and tumble back. At 150 meters, he breaks off, pulling hard on the stick, rolling away before the combined fire of multiple bombers can converge on his position. He expects the damaged B-17 to falter, to drop from formation, to begin its terminal descent. Instead, it continues flying, maintaining altitude and speed, its remaining engines carrying the weight that 3 engines should bear. Stigler has shot down 42 aircraft during his combat career. He knows what mortally wounded aircraft look like, knows the moment when an airplane transitions from damaged to doomed. This bomber should be dying. By every measure of combat experience he possesses, that B-17 should be going down. It does not. The German High Command had expected the American daylight bombing campaign to collapse within weeks. The strategic assessment seemed sound, based on empirical evidence provided by British losses. The Luftwaffe had forced the RAF to abandon daylight operations through simple arithmetic. Loss rates exceeded replacement rates, and no air force could sustain such mathematics indefinitely. British planners, after calculating the cost in aircraft and crews, made the rational decision to preserve their force by avoiding its destruction. The Germans expected American commanders to perform the same calculation and reach the same conclusion. But the Americans possessed advantages that British planners lacked, resources so vast they distorted traditional military economics. American industrial production in 1943 would build more than 85,000 aircraft, along with the engines, instruments, weapons, and millions of component parts required to make them fly. The Boeing plant in Seattle alone would complete 16 B-17s every day, each one representing 40,000 man-hours of labor, 1,500 separate subassemblies, and material requisitions that stretched across an entire continent. Consolidated would produce B-24 Liberators at similar rates. Douglas would manufacture dive bombers and transport aircraft. North American would build fighters and trainers. Republic, Lockheed, Grumman, Curtiss, and dozens of other manufacturers would operate around the clock, transforming raw materials into military aircraft at rates that no other nation could match. Behind the aircraft production stood even more staggering numbers: the training infrastructure that created aircrews. The United States operated dozens of training bases across the American South and Southwest, where weather permitted year-round flight operations. Each month, thousands of young men entered the pipeline as aviation cadets and emerged as pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. The training program consumed aircraft faster than combat operations, accepting high accident rates as the necessary cost of mass production. Instructors pushed students through compressed curricula, teaching in months what peacetime training had accomplished in years. The quality of individual airmen suffered compared to pre-war standards, but quantity compensated for quality. The American system could accept casualty rates that would cripple other air forces, because the replacement pipeline operated at such scale that even heavy losses could be absorbed and replaced. German intelligence officers compiled these production figures, presented them to command staff, and watched senior officers reject the numbers as impossible exaggerations. No industrial system could manufacture aircraft like artillery shells, they insisted. The reports must reflect Allied propaganda, inflated claims designed to spread defeatism. Even officers who accepted the data struggled to comprehend its implications. The entire German aircraft industry would produce fewer than 25,000 aircraft in 1943, despite operating under wartime emergency measures, despite stripping resources from other sectors, despite mobilizing forced labor from occupied territories. America would build more than triple that number while simultaneously conducting major operations in two different theaters and supplying aircraft to Allied nations. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that German fighters would inflict unsustainable losses on American daylight raids. His fighter pilots were veterans, technically skilled, flying superior aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, introduced in 1941, exceeded the performance of any Allied fighter then operational. German pilots had accumulated years of combat experience, first in Spain, then Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, tactical formations, all the technical aspects of aerial combat that required extensive training to master. They would, Goering promised, destroy the American bombers faster than American factories could replace them. And in the first months of the American Daylight Campaign, German assessments seemed validated. American losses ran high, occasionally catastrophic. The October 1943 raids on Schweinfurt would cost 60 bombers in a single day, 600 men killed or captured, loss rates approaching 30%. At such rates, bomber crews faced overwhelming odds of completing their required 25-mission tour. The mathematics of survival became exercises in probability, calculating the likelihood of death with the same dispassionate logic that engineers use to calculate structural stress tolerances. But the Americans, instead of retreating to night operations as the British had done, doubled their commitment to daylight precision bombing. They increased the size of raids, putting more aircraft into the air, accepting higher absolute losses while maintaining similar percentage rates. They modified defensive tactics, adjusting formations, varying altitudes, coordinating fighter escorts more effectively. They accepted that the campaign would consume thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men as the necessary price of strategic bombing, and they paid that price without hesitation because they possessed resources sufficient to pay it. The B-17 Flying Fortress embodied American industrial philosophy transformed into military hardware. The aircraft represented over-engineering, redundancy, and margin of safety built into every system. Where German aircraft designers minimized weight to maximize performance, American designers accepted additional weight to provide crew protection and aircraft survivability. The B-17 incorporated armor plating around critical crew positions, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb small arms fire without igniting, redundant control systems allowing pilots to fly the aircraft even with primary systems damaged or destroyed. The aircraft could return to base missing entire sections of wing, with engines shot away, with control surfaces barely functional, and still land safely. German pilots, attacking these bombers, discovered that their conventional tactics produced insufficient results. A Messerschmitt 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 carried enough ammunition for approximately 15 seconds of sustained fire from all weapons. Against fighters, this proved adequate. A 1 or 2 second burst often sufficed to destroy a single-engine aircraft. But heavy bombers absorbed punishment that would atomize fighters. Pilots learned they needed to close to point-blank range, 200 meters or less, and hold fire until the massive target filled their entire windscreen. Even then, even with cannon shells tearing through aluminum skin and explosive rounds detonating inside the fuselage, the bombers continued flying. Stigler, returning to base after the Wilhelmshaven raid, lands with ammunition expended and fuel tanks nearly empty. Ground crew swarm his fighter immediately, refueling and rearming while the engine still cools, preparing the aircraft for another sortie. The entire squadron has landed with similar urgency, every pilot reporting the same story. Heavy engagement, multiple attacks, results uncertain. They claimed kills, as fighter pilots always claimed kills, but even veterans like Stigler felt doubt about their assessments. Did that bomber he hit actually go down, or did it simply drop out of formation temporarily before recovering and continuing homeward? Did those engine fires he observed actually doom the aircraft, or did the crew extinguish them and limp back to England? The old certainties of fighter combat, the clean victories and confirmed kills, became ambiguous when attacking aircraft that refused to die conventionally. In the debriefing room, intelligence officers record pilot claims and combine them into aggregate numbers that will become official Luftwaffe records. They credit the squadron with destroying 23 American bombers. Stigler knows the actual number is lower, probably half that total, possibly less. Every pilot makes similar calculations, inflating estimates in the chaos of combat, mistaking damage for destruction, counting the same aircraft multiple times as different pilots attack it. But the intelligence officers need numbers for reports, and pilots provide numbers, and the bureaucracy transforms subjective estimates into objective facts that generals will use for strategic planning. What troubles Stigler, what he struggles to articulate during the debriefing, is not the mathematics of claims versus kills, but the visceral experience of attacking aircraft that should not survive. He has attacked bombers before, British Lancasters and Halifaxes during their earlier daylight attempts. Those aircraft, when hit, responded predictably. They burned, broke apart, fell. The B-17s burned and kept flying. They sustained damage that should trigger structural failure and maintained formation. They lost engines and continued toward targets. The technical explanation existed somewhere in engineering specifications, in structural design and redundant systems, but experiencing the phenomenon felt like encountering something that violated natural law. His squadron commander, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, shares similar observations. The Major flew against RAF bombers in 1940 and 1941, knows what it means to attack heavy aircraft defended by concentrated fire. But the American formations, he notes, operate with different psychology. British bombers, when heavily engaged, would scatter, each aircraft taking evasive action individually, seeking cloud cover or lower altitude. The defensive formation would dissolve as survival instinct overcame tactical discipline. American formations hold. Individual aircraft burn, trail smoke, fly with visible damage, and they maintain position, holding altitude and heading regardless of damage. The formation becomes more important than the individual aircraft, the mission more important than survival. This troubles the Major on a fundamental level, because it reveals an opponent whose doctrine accepts casualties as operational cost. The Luftwaffe fights to achieve objectives while minimizing losses, because Germany cannot replace experienced pilots easily. Training takes time, fuel and instructor hours that the German military increasingly lacks. Every experienced pilot becomes a valuable asset whose loss degrades overall effectiveness. German tactics evolved to emphasize survival as much as victory, conserving the veteran corps that provided institutional knowledge and combat effectiveness. The Americans, it seems, calculate differently. They accept that most bomber crews will not survive their 25-mission tour. They accept that replacing losses requires feeding young men into a machine that consumes them faster than any rational military system should tolerate. And they possess the industrial and demographic resources to sustain such consumption, treating men and machines as ammunition to be expended achieving strategic objectives. Kowalski's crew lands at Molesworth 8 hours after departure, the aircraft riding on damaged landing gear that holds just long enough to complete rollout. The B-17 looks like something that should be scrapped, not flown again. Cannon shell holes perforate the wings, fuselage, and tail section. The No. 3 engine is missing its cowling entirely, torn away by gunfire during the initial fighter attack. Hydraulic fluid has painted rust-colored stains along the belly. Several control cables are visible through ripped aluminum panels, and the tail gunner's position has been partially shot away. Ground crew chief walks around the aircraft twice, examining damage, shaking his head in professional assessment that combines pride and disbelief. The crew climbs out stiffly, 9 men who entered the aircraft before dawn now emerging in afternoon light. The ball turret gunner needs help extracting from his position, his legs numb from 6 hours compressed into the spherical turret. The tail gunner has superficial wounds from aluminum fragments, but refused to leave his position during combat. The pilot writes up a dozen discrepancies in the maintenance log, damage requiring repair before the aircraft flies again. The crew chief glances at the list, then at the aircraft, and estimates 3 days minimum to return it to mission-ready status. Kowalski walks away from the bomber without looking back. Some crews name their aircraft, paint nose art, personalize the machines they fly. He has deliberately avoided this practice, maintaining emotional distance from equipment he knows will eventually be destroyed. B-17s are tools, not mascots. They exist to carry bombs to targets and return crews to base, and when they fail at either task, they are replaced. This particular aircraft served its function today. Whether it serves again tomorrow or next week does not concern him. He will fly whatever airplane the squadron assigns, aboard whatever aircraft remains airworthy when the next mission launches. In the debriefing room, an intelligence officer asks standardized questions about fighter attacks, flak concentrations, bombing results, and crew performance. Kowalski answers mechanically, providing information without analysis. He saw fighters. He fired at them. Whether he hit them, he cannot say. The entire engagement occupies perhaps 90 seconds in his memory, but those 90 seconds contain more violence than the previous 23 years of his life combined. He grew up in Chicago, worked in a steel mill before enlistment, knows hard labor and industrial danger. Combat bears no resemblance to anything in his civilian experience. The mill could kill you through accident or carelessness. Combat kills you through intention and precision. The intelligence officer notes that Kowalski's bomber was attacked by an estimated 15 different fighters during the mission. The aircraft recorded over 200 bullet and cannon strike marks across its airframe. Statistical analysis suggests the crew should have sustained casualties. That they returned intact represents probability deviation, luck in pure mathematical form. The officer does not mention that most bomber crews do not complete their 25 mission requirement, that loss rates make completion unlikely for any individual crew. These are statistics best left unspoken, numbers that exist in operational planning documents but not in conversations with the men those numbers describe. After debriefing, Kowalski returns to his barracks, strips off his flight suit, and discovers his hands are shaking. The tremor is involuntary, some neurological response to sustained stress finally expressing itself now that immediate danger has passed. He sits on his bunk, staring at his hands as they shake, recognizing this as the cost his body extracts for 4 hours of hypervigilance in combat. Around him, other crew members display their own responses. One man sleeps immediately, collapsing into unconsciousness. Another talks rapidly, nervously, recounting the mission in detailed fragments. The tail gunner sits quietly, methodically cleaning blood from his face, where aluminum fragments cut shallow lines across his cheek. No one mentions the B-17 that fell out of formation during the fighter attack, the one they watched dive away with smoke streaming from its fuselage. That aircraft carried 10 men whose names they knew, men they ate breakfast with this morning, men who no longer exist in any form except memory and casualty reports. To acknowledge their absence means confronting the statistical reality that any of them, any mission, could simply end in similar fashion. The psychological defense mechanisms that allow men to repeatedly fly into combat require not thinking about certain things, maintaining mental compartments that separate duty from fear. Across the channel, German fighter pilots compare similar experiences. The shared recognition among Luftwaffe veterans, discussed quietly between missions, centers on a troubling pattern. American losses remain high, but not catastrophically high. The mathematics that destroyed British daylight operations do not seem to apply to American raids. The Americans lose aircraft, sometimes dozens in a single mission, but they return the next day with formations just as large, sometimes larger. They replace losses faster than German fighters inflict them. The war of attrition that should favor the defender increasingly favors the attacker whose resources permit sustained losses. Stigler, drinking coffee in the pilot's ready room, listens to younger pilots describe their attacks. They speak with enthusiasm, claiming certain kills, describing bombers exploding or breaking apart. He does not contradict them because contradiction serves no purpose. Let them maintain their certainty. Experience will teach them what it taught him, that nothing in aerial combat is certain, that many aircraft described as destroyed actually survive, that the heroic narratives they construct around their actions simplify realities far more complex and ambiguous. What concerns Stigler, what keeps him awake during the brief hours between missions, is the recognition that he fights on behalf of a nation whose resources cannot sustain the campaign Germany has initiated. He has fought on 4 different fronts, has seen the gradual deterioration of equipment quality, the steady decline in fuel availability, the replacement pilots arriving with fewer training hours and less proficiency. The Luftwaffe that destroyed the Polish Air Force in 1939 no longer exists. That force has been consumed, expended across 3 years of sustained operations, replaced by this shadow organization that maintains capability through the skill of veterans like himself, but lacks the depth to replace those veterans when they inevitably fall. The Americans, conversely, improve. Their pilots gain experience. Their tactics evolve. Their equipment arrives in greater quantities and higher quality. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighters now escorting bomber formations exceed the performance of earlier American fighters. Soon, intelligence reports indicate the Americans will deploy the P-51 Mustang, a fighter with sufficient range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. When that happens, when German fighters must engage American escort fighters before attacking bombers, the defensive advantage evaporates entirely. Stigler understands with the clarity that combat veterans sometimes achieve that he witnesses the end of something. The Luftwaffe will continue fighting, will inflict casualties, will occasionally achieve tactical victories. But the strategic outcome has already been determined by industrial capacity and resource allocation. Germany fights 3 major opponents simultaneously, dividing finite resources across multiple theaters. America fights with the economic output of an entire continent mobilized for war production, protected by 2 oceans from direct attack, supplying not only its own forces, but also providing material support to Britain and Russia. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Germany cannot win a war of attrition against opponents whose combined resources exceed its own by such magnitude. But Stigler also recognizes that understanding strategic inevitability does not release him from tactical responsibility. He will continue flying, continue fighting, continue attempting to destroy American bombers, because these are the orders he received and the duty he accepted. The war grinds forward regardless of individual comprehension. Men fight and die whether their deaths serve ultimate victory or merely delay inevitable defeat. His role is to be the best fighter pilot circumstances permit, to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing friendly losses, to perform his function within the machine until the machine stops operating. The symbol that comes to define this period, for German pilots who survive long enough to reflect, is not a weapon or aircraft but simple abundance. Shot down American airmen, captured and processed into prisoner-of-war camps, carry emergency rations that astound their captors. German soldiers, subsisting on black bread and ersatz coffee, discover American flight rations containing chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, and concentrated nutrition in packages smaller than a boot. These rations, designed for survival situations, exceed the quality of food available to German frontline troops. Captured airmen wear electrically heated flight suits powered by aircraft generators, insulated boots lined with sheepskin, leather gloves of quality that German pilots envy. Their survival vests contain first aid supplies, water purification tablets, fishing line, and dozens of small items that reflect an approach to military logistics utterly foreign to German experience. One captured American bomber crew, interrogated at a Luftwaffe facility, casually mentions that their base in England served fresh eggs for breakfast. The German intelligence officer conducting the interrogation initially dismisses this as fabrication. These small details accumulate into larger understanding. The Americans do not simply possess more resources, they operate from an entirely different baseline of material abundance. What constitutes luxury in German military logistics represents routine supply in American operations. The gap extends beyond military equipment into fundamental assumptions about what standard quality means. An American aircraft mechanic expects tools that German mechanics would consider precision instruments. An American pilot receives flight gear that German pilots acquire only through personal purchase or battlefield salvage. The entire American military machine operates at a level of material provision that reflects an economy capable of sustaining both massive military expansion and continued civilian consumption. German propaganda attempting to counter American material superiority emphasizes spiritual qualities, national will, ideological commitment. Photographs show determined soldiers, advanced technology, confident leaders. Radio broadcasts describe American society as decadent, soft, lacking the martial spirit necessary for sustained conflict. The propaganda creates narratives about weak opponents who will collapse when confronted with German strength and determination. Pilots like Stigler, who engage these supposedly weak opponents in combat, recognize the propaganda as hollow compensation for material deficiency. The Americans are not soft. Their bomber crews fly through flak and fighters with the same determination German crews display. Their formation discipline, maintaining position despite casualties, demonstrates tactical cohesion equal to any force Germany fields. They die courageously, fighting their guns until their aircraft disintegrate, showing no less commitment than German airmen show. The difference lies not in will or courage, but in the industrial foundation that produces their aircraft, trains their crews, and supplies their operations at scales Germany cannot match. This recognition demoralizes in ways that combat losses do not. Losing battles to superior courage or tactical skill allows for improvement, for adaptation, for the possibility of eventual victory through enhanced performance. Losing through simple material disadvantage, through an opponent's ability to replace losses faster than you can inflict them, offers no comparable hope. The contest becomes mathematical rather than martial, determined by production rates and resource availability rather than combat effectiveness. The transformation in German pilot psychology, from confidence to recognition of inevitable defeat, occurs gradually across 1943 and into 1944. Early missions against American bombers produce optimistic assessments. The Luftwaffe claims hundreds of bombers destroyed, calculates unsustainable American loss rates, predicts the campaign's collapse. But the Americans continue coming, in larger formations, with better escorts, refining tactics that reduce German effectiveness. Bomber formations begin employing chaff, metallic strips that confuse German radar. Fighter escorts extend their range, engaging German fighters farther from bomber formations. The tactical environment shifts steadily toward conditions that favor attackers over defenders. German fighter production increases during this period, not through improved industrial efficiency, but through desperate resource reallocation. Aircraft factories receive priority for materials and labor at the expense of other military production. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, performs organizational miracles to increase output despite Allied bombing of German industrial centers. Fighter production rises to levels that would have seemed impossible in 1941. But these increased numbers cannot offset pilot losses. Training programs, compressed to graduate pilots faster, produce airmen with fewer flight hours and less proficiency. Veteran pilots die or burn out from sustained operations. The average skill level across the Luftwaffe fighter force declines even as aircraft numbers increase. Stigler, now commanding his own squadron, watches replacement pilots arrive with dangerously inadequate preparation. Men who should have received 6 months training complete the program in 3 months, graduating with 100 flight hours when veterans believe 200 hours minimum are necessary for combat readiness. These young pilots die at catastrophic rates, sometimes on their first mission, killed by American escorts before they ever engage bombers. Their deaths serve no strategic purpose, achieve no military objective, simply consume young men in a machine that processes them as raw material. The squadron commander role forces Stigler to confront mathematics he previously avoided. He must staff missions, assign pilots, maintain operational readiness while watching his unit's strength decline through attrition. Replacement pilots arrive, receive brief orientation, fly several missions, then die or are wounded. A few survive long enough to develop competency. Most do not. He writes letters to families, formal notifications of death or capture, knowing the words provide no actual comfort, but following the ritual because the ritual maintains connection to something human within the mechanical brutality of industrial warfare. During one mission in early 1944, Stigler encounters a lone B-17, badly damaged, struggling to return to England. The bomber flies below normal altitude, separated from its formation, clearly crippled. Protocol dictates he attack and destroy it. He positions his fighter for the approach, closes to firing range, sees through the damaged fuselage to the crew inside. The waist gunner's position is destroyed, the man at that station clearly dead or wounded. The tail gunner's position shows similar damage. The aircraft poses no threat, can barely maintain flight, will possibly crash before reaching England. Stigler makes a decision that violates orders and military logic. He does not fire. Instead, he flies formation on the bomber, escorting it toward the English Channel, preventing other German fighters from attacking. He recognizes that this crew fought today, flew their mission, suffered their casualties, and deserved the warriors' chance to reach home. The line between enemy and fellow airmen blurs in this moment. They are adversaries, but they are also men who fly, who face the same sky and the same dangers, who share more commonality with each other than with ground forces or civilians who cannot understand what combat in 3 dimensions demands. At the Channel coast, Stigler breaks away, saluting the damaged bomber before turning back toward Germany. The B-17 continues across the water, eventually landing in England with a crew who will tell a story about the German fighter pilot who spared them, who flew escort instead of attacking, who showed mercy when military necessity demanded destruction. The story will circulate through bomber squadrons, become legend, eventually result in Stigler and the American pilot meeting decades after the war, forming friendship from that single encounter above the North Sea. But mercy represents luxury that the strategic situation increasingly prohibits. By summer 1944, when Allied forces land in Normandy, the air war over Germany has reached intensity that makes individual encounters irrelevant to outcomes. The Americans now fly missions of over 1,000 bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, attacking targets. Throughout German territory, the Luftwaffe, despite achieving local tactical successes, cannot prevent the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity. Oil refineries burn, ball-bearing factories collapse, transportation networks dissolve under repeated attacks. The economic foundation that sustains military operations erodes steadily. German fighters increasingly lack fuel for training and operations. Experienced pilots sit idle because no aviation gasoline exists to power their aircraft. When fuel becomes available, operations launch with whatever quantity permits, sometimes enough for a single mission, sometimes barely enough to reach combat altitude and engage before reserves run critically low. Pilots learn to calculate fuel consumption with desperate precision, knowing that running dry means bailing out or crash landing, either outcome removing them from operational status. The material abundance that characterized American operations now manifests as overwhelming force. Bomber formations fill the sky from horizon to horizon. Fighter escorts fly top cover at multiple altitudes. Ground attack aircraft strafe German airfields, destroying aircraft before they launch. The Luftwaffe, which began the war as the most technologically advanced air force in existence, ends it as a scattered resistance force employing tactics of desperation. Kowalski completes his 25-mission tour in August 1944, beating statistical odds that predicted he would not. His crew survives intact, another statistical anomaly, and they return to the United States as veterans whose service has concluded. At the ceremony where they receive their air medals, Kowalski stands with men who flew through the same missions, endured the same risks, survived the same mathematics of probability that consumed so many others. He feels no particular pride or accomplishment, only relief that his obligation has ended, and he remains alive to experience that ending. He does not think about the German pilots he fired at, does not calculate how many men he killed or aircraft he destroyed. These questions have no useful answers. He fired weapons when aircraft attacked his bomber, following training and instinct, attempting to protect himself and his crew. Whether specific bullets struck specific targets, whether the men in those targets died or survived, exists beyond his knowledge or concern. The moral weight of combat, distributed across millions of individual actions by millions of individuals, becomes too diffuse for any single person to bear meaningfully. After the war, when historians compile records and statistics, the numbers reveal patterns that participants could not perceive during events. The 8th Air Force, conducting strategic bombing operations from England, lost over 26,000 men killed and over 20,000 aircraft destroyed during its operational period. These casualties exceeded the entire Marine Corps losses during the Pacific Campaign. Individual bomber crews faced life expectancy measured in missions completed, with statistical survival probability declining sharply after 15 missions. Yet the campaign continued, crew after crew, mission after mission, because strategic doctrine demanded persistence and industrial capacity permitted replacing losses. The Luftwaffe lost over 70% of its fighter pilots during the war's final 2 years, a casualty rate that destroyed institutional knowledge and combat effectiveness. Pilots like Stigler, who survived through combination of skill and chance, became rare exceptions in a force increasingly staffed by inadequately trained replacements. The strategic air defense of Germany, despite tactical successes and technological innovation, failed to prevent the systematic destruction of German war production. The Flying Fortress, that symbol of American industrial might, proved neither invulnerable nor decisive by itself. Individual aircraft were destroyed regularly, shot down by fighters or flak or mechanical failure. But the concept the B-17 represented, the doctrine of daylight precision bombing conducted by aircraft designed for crew survival and mission completion, achieved strategic objectives that justified tactical costs. The bomber forced Germany to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive organization. It destroyed industrial capacity necessary for sustained warfare. It demonstrated American ability to project power deep into enemy territory through material abundance rather than tactical elegance. German pilots, in their post-war accounts, describe the B-17 with respect bordering on awe. They shot down hundreds of these aircraft, killed thousands of American airmen, inflicted casualties that would have broken other nations' campaigns. And still the bombers came, mission after mission, absorbing losses that seemed unsustainable, representing an opponent whose resources exceeded German capacity to destroy them. The psychological impact of facing endless replacement, of knowing that every aircraft destroyed would be replaced by 2 more, degraded German morale more effectively than any propaganda campaign could achieve. The larger truth, the pattern that emerges from accumulated detail, reveals warfare transformed by industrial capacity. Previous conflicts rewarded tactical skill, strategic positioning, leadership quality, national will. These factors remained relevant in the Second World War, but subordinate to manufacturing capability and resource availability. The side that produced more aircraft, trained more pilots, supplied more fuel, manufactured more ammunition, ultimately prevailed regardless of tactical outcomes. Individual battles mattered less than aggregate capacity. Heroism and sacrifice, while meaningful to participants, influenced outcomes less than production schedules and logistics networks. The B-17 epitomized this transformation. The aircraft represented American acceptance that warfare had become industrial process, that victory required treating military equipment as consumable material to be expended achieving objectives. German aircraft designers, inheriting traditions from the Great War, still thought of individual aircraft as valuable assets requiring preservation. American designers thought of aircraft as mission-specific tools to be used until destroyed, then replaced from production that exceeded consumption. This philosophical difference, expressed through engineering choices and tactical doctrine, determined outcomes more than courage or commitment. German pilots flew aircraft optimized for performance at the cost of survivability. American pilots flew aircraft optimized for crew protection and system redundancy at the cost of maximum performance. When both sides engaged in sustained combat, the American approach proved superior not because it produced better individual outcomes, but because it enabled sustained operations at scales German approaches could not match. The men who flew these aircraft, German and American alike, shared more commonality than their respective nations. They understood the unique demands of aerial combat, the isolation of fighting in 3 dimensions, the mechanical dependence that placed their lives in the hands of engines and airframes and systems that could fail. Pilots acknowledged German fighter pilots' skill and courage, recognizing that they fought effectively despite material disadvantages. But individual respect between warriors does not determine strategic outcomes. Wars end when nations exhaust their capacity to continue fighting, when the accumulated destruction exceeds the ability to replace losses, when the mathematics of attrition produce conclusions that military force cannot reverse. Germany exhausted itself fighting opponents whose combined resources exceeded its own by magnitudes that courage and skill could not overcome. The air war over Europe demonstrated this reality with clarity that ground combat sometimes obscured. The side with more resources, applied persistently despite losses, eventually prevails. Kowalski, decades after the war, visits the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson and stands before a restored B-17. The aircraft looks pristine, polished aluminum reflecting overhead lights, none of the battle damage and weathering he remembers. He walks around it slowly, noting details. The waist gun position, where he spent hours in frozen terror. The bomb bay that carried ordnance they released over German cities. The cockpit where pilots struggled with damaged controls to bring damaged aircraft home. The museum placard describes the B-17 specifications and combat record in sanitized language that conveys information without experience. He does not share his memories with other museum visitors. They would not understand, cannot understand, the specific quality of fear and violence that characterized bomber operations. The sanitized aircraft, restored and static, represents history that has been processed into narrative, cleaned of the blood and terror and random death that made the actual experience nearly unbearable. Let them see the aircraft as symbol. He knows it as tool, as machine that kept him alive through 25 missions, despite probability and circumstance that should have killed him. Stigler in Germany occasionally speaks to aviation history groups about his wartime service. He describes missions factually, avoiding both heroic narrative and excessive focus on German defeat. He fought as a Luftwaffe officer, followed orders, attempted to perform his duty professionally. The larger questions about the war's morality and Germany's responsibility he leaves to historians and philosophers. He knows what he experienced personally. Combat that tested every skill he possessed, losses that depleted squadrons faster than training could replace pilots, eventual defeat by opponents whose resources exceeded German capacity to resist. The two men, Kowalski and Stigler, eventually meet through efforts by researchers investigating the incident where Stigler spared the damaged bomber. Their encounter, decades after conflict, demonstrates something the war itself obscured: that enemies can become friends when circumstances change, that the bonds formed by shared experience transcend national boundaries and wartime animosities. They remain in contact for years, two old men who once tried to kill each other, now united by recognition that they survived horror most people cannot imagine. The legacy of the Flying Fortress, beyond its technical specifications and combat record, lies in what it represented about American power. The aircraft demonstrated that democracy, despite its inefficiencies and contradictions, could mobilize industrial capacity that autocracy could not match. The United States, through voluntary enlistment and industrial production supported by civilian population, generated military force that exceeded what totalitarian systems achieved through compulsion and total state control. The American system accepted higher short-term costs, more chaotic organization, less centralized planning, and still produced superior results. This pattern extended beyond aircraft production into every aspect of military logistics. American forces operated with supply chains that delivered not just essential equipment, but also comfort items, recreational materials, and quality-of-life improvements that other nations considered impossible luxuries. The effect on morale and operational capability proved decisive. Well-supplied troops, knowing their nation provided for their needs comprehensively, fought with confidence that poorly supplied troops could not sustain. The B-17, flying through German airspace, carried more than bombs. It carried the implicit message that America possessed resources sufficient to sustain losses that would cripple other nations, that American industrial might exceed German capacity to destroy it, that the outcome of strategic warfare would be determined by manufacturing capability rather than tactical brilliance. German pilots, attacking these bombers, fought against this reality with skill and courage. But skill and courage alone could not overcome material disadvantage measured in ratios of 5-to-1 or 10-to-1. The air war over Europe consumed over 100,000 American, British, and German lives, destroyed thousands of aircraft, reduced cities to rubble, and ultimately demonstrated that modern warfare rewards industrial capacity above all other factors. The side that produces more, that replaces losses faster, that sustains operations through attrition, prevails regardless of tactical skill or individual heroism. This lesson, learned at terrible cost, shaped military doctrine for decades after the conflict ended. And in the end, what remains is memory. The memory of men who flew impossible missions and somehow survived. The memory of aircraft that absorbed damage that should have destroyed them and continued flying. The memory of a conflict so vast and destructive that individual experiences become statistics, numbers in historical records that convey information without horror. The B-17 survives in museums and histories as symbol of American power and technological achievement. The men who flew them, and the men who fought against them, survive as memories fading with each passing year, taking with them the specific texture of experiences that shaped them and defined an era. The sky above Germany, once filled with contrails and combat, now carries only commercial traffic, civilian aircraft following routes that pass over cities that were once rubble. The young men who fought at 27,000 feet are old now, or dead, their struggles reduced to history books and museum displays. But the lesson they taught, written in burning aircraft and young men's lives, endures. That freedom, supported by industrial might and national will, can defeat tyranny despite tactical setbacks and terrible costs. The flying fortresses proved this through simple persistence, flying mission after mission despite losses, until the cumulative weight of American power made German resistance impossible. They could not believe the bombers survived. But survival, in the end, mattered less than replacement. And America, alone among nations, possessed the capacity to replace everything it lost, until nothing remained to oppose it but memory and defeat.